Hi, I am Lauren Holt Pierce, 31 years old, a school counselor in Austin, Texas, and my whole job is teaching people how to stay steady when someone tries to shake them. I used to think that skill made me safe. Last winter proved the opposite. My dad, Richard, invited everyone to a family dinner and sold it like a peace offering. He said it was just a nice night out, just family, just food. But the second Ethan and I walked in, I realized it was not a family dinner. It was a stage. He picked the steakhouse that made you feel underdressed no matter what you wore, dark wood, heavy menus, waiters moving like they were trained for a courtroom. My dad was already there, sitting like he owned the room, with 12 relatives around the table and 2 of his clients at the corner smiling politely like they were watching a show they did not pay for. That was the first hook in my stomach. Why are his clients here? My brother Brandon stood as soon as we arrived, grinning like it was a celebration. His phone was already in his hand, not casually, not because he was texting, but the way people hold a camera when they want proof. My mom, Denise, gave me that soft smile she always gives when she wants me to behave, the smile that says, "Keep it together, keep the peace, do not make your father look bad." Ethan squeezed my hand under the table. He did not know the rules as well as I did. He still believed respect was automatic, not something you had to earn twice. Dinner started normal, small talk, bread basket, Brandon telling everyone about his promotion like he was accepting an award. My dad leaned into it, praising Brandon, calling him a natural leader, saying the Holt name was built on winners, making sure the clients heard it and the relatives nodded. Then he turned his attention toward my husband like he was about to sign off on a purchase. He asked Ethan about work, but the question was not curiosity. It was a trap. Ethan answered politely, calm and steady, the way he always is. He kept it simple, talked about projects and growth, and where he saw himself in a year. He did not brag. He did not beg. My dad smiled like that was the funniest thing he had heard all week, then lifted his glass, looked down the table and said, "Brandon, you're the kind of man who owns his life." He paused, and I felt the air change. Then he turned to Ethan and said, "And you look like a man who rents his life." It landed like a slap. A couple people laughed quickly like they had been trained to laugh on command. One of my aunts covered her mouth like she was shocked but still smiling. The clients chuckled awkwardly, unsure if they were allowed to find it funny. Brandon laughed the loudest, and his phone lifted slightly like he wanted the moment framed and saved. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did the thing I teach my students. I counted breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I looked at my mom and she smiled too, not big, not loud, just a small controlled smile, the kind that could mean fear or loyalty or both. And in that second I could not tell which one it was. My dad kept going. He asked Ethan what he really makes, saying really like Ethan had already lied. He joked about how expensive everything was now. He said marriage is easier when a man can provide. He glanced at me and added one line he knew would hook into my spine. He mentioned my inheritance like it was a leash, not a gift, not a future blessing, a leash. That was when the questions started stacking in my head so fast I could barely keep my face neutral. What is my dad protecting that he needs to embarrass my husband in public? Why is Brandon filming parts of this like he expects something to happen? What does my dad think he is buying with that inheritance threat? And the biggest question, what is Ethan going to do next? Because Ethan did not flinch. He did not snap back. He did not play the same game. He just sat there quiet, listening, watching like he was memorizing every word for later. 6 months later, we were in a glass boardroom in downtown Austin at 9:30 a.m., and a CEO slid a contract across the table and said the deal is yours, with one condition. My dad read the first page and went completely still. He could not speak, not because he was being polite, but because he finally understood who Ethan was and what was inside Ethan's leather folder. And he understood it in front of the same kind of audience he used to control. If your family ever tested your loyalty this way, comment stay or leave, because I had to choose, and that choice changed everything. Next, you need the family hierarchy that made my dad think he could say anything and never pay for it. My dad, Richard Holt, ran our family the way some men run a business. There was a chain of command, a brand to protect, and a clear reward system. If you made him look good, you got warmth. If you made him look questioned, you got punishment dressed up as advice. Everyone learned to orbit his moods like they were weather. You checked his tone before you spoke, watched his face before you laughed, memorized the topics that made him feel powerful, and avoided the ones that made him feel cornered. In our house, peace was not a feeling, it was a performance. My brother Brandon was the golden child, and it was never subtle. When Brandon messed up, my dad turned it into a funny story at dinner. Brandon forgot to pay a bill. My dad said boys will be boys. Brandon got a speeding ticket. My dad laughed and said he has drive. Brandon flunked a class in college. My dad blamed the professor and said Brandon was too smart for boring rules. But when I succeeded, it became normal. When I worked hard, it became expected. When I struggled, it became weakness. My mom, Denise, kept everything smooth, but smooth for who mattered. She called it respect and said it like it was a virtue. Respect your father. Respect the family. Respect the way things are done. And every time my dad crossed a line, she would come to me later and whisper, "Just apologize first, Lauren, keep the peace." Even when I was not wrong, especially when I was not wrong. That was how the hierarchy stayed clean. My dad did the damage, my mom managed the fallout, and I swallowed it because I was trained to be the stabilizer. I became the overgiver without realizing I had been drafted. I handled bills when my grandparents got sick, scheduled appointments, filled prescriptions, called insurance, and organized every holiday like it was my job. When my dad wanted to look generous, he volunteered my time, and when relatives praised him, he let them believe he was the one doing the work. I was the person behind the curtain, the quiet labor holding up his image. One memory explains why that dinner hit me so hard. Senior awards night in Round Rock. I can still see the gym lights, the folding chairs, the cheap bouquet my friend handed me, and the plaque in my hands that felt heavier than it should have. I had earned it. I stayed late, studied, tutored classmates, and kept my grades perfect while helping at home. For one night, I let myself believe my dad might be proud in a simple way. In the car afterward, I held the plaque on my lap and waited for him to say something kind, but he did not even glance at it. He just drove, jaw tight, radio low, like my success was background noise. Then he said, "Do not think this makes you special. Not congratulations. Not I am proud. Not you worked hard. Just a warning, like my accomplishment was dangerous." 2 minutes later, Brandon said he was hungry and wanted burgers, and my dad pulled into a drive-thru without hesitation, joking with him and asking what he wanted like Brandon was the son. I asked if we could stop at the library on the way home because a book I needed was due and I had a project the next week. My dad did not look at me. He said, "You already read enough." That was the whole system in one short drive. Brandon asked, Brandon received. I asked, I got diminished. So by the time I met Ethan, I was already trained. Trained to shrink my needs, trained to anticipate moods, trained to take responsibility for everyone else. Ethan noticed before I did. He saw how I tensed when my phone lit up with my dad's name. He saw how I offered to fix things that were not mine. He saw how my mom would call me after fights and act like I was the problem for reacting. One day, after a rough visit, Ethan came home with a navy leather folder and handed it to me like it was both a quiet gift and a quiet plan. He said, "Keep your records, Lauren, not for revenge, for reality, because people who rewrite history hate receipts." I laughed at the time like it was dramatic, but that folder became my anchor. It held counseling notes, sure, but it also held dates, screenshots, and the small facts I used to forget the moment my parents told me I was imagining things. And that is why I froze at the dinner, not because I was weak, but because my whole life taught me that if I stayed calm, agreeable, and quiet, maybe I could keep love from being taken away. But that night, watching my dad humiliate Ethan, I finally understood something I had avoided for years. My dad was not just trying to control me. He was testing whether Ethan would accept being controlled too, and I still did not know what my dad would do when Ethan stopped playing small. The dinner was not random. It only looked sudden because it happened in a restaurant with witnesses. In reality, it was the loudest version of a pattern my dad had practiced for years, just polished and performed in public. Once I started looking backward with clear eyes, the pattern became obvious. Memory one was my college move-in week. I had just arrived at my apartment near campus in Austin. Boxes everywhere, books stacked on the floor, that nervous excitement people feel when life is starting to open up. My dad showed up with a shoebox full of wrinkled papers and set it on my kitchen counter like it belonged there. Inside were invoices, gas receipts, and tax notes from his business. He said, "You're good at paperwork, fix this. Brandon is too busy." I remember staring at the box because I thought he was joking. It was my first week of classes. I had orientation, a job interview, and housing forms to finish. I told him maybe I could help later. My mom stepped in immediately, telling me not to stir things up because my father already had enough stress. My dad looked at me like I had insulted him and said, "Stop acting like a victim. It is just organizing." So I did it. 2 full weekends sitting on the floor with a calculator, lining up receipts, labeling envelopes, and calling vendors to confirm totals. When I finally handed the folder to his accountant, the man flipped through it and said it cleaned up about $3,000 in confusion. My dad never mentioned it again. Not thank you, not good work, not even acknowledgement, just silence like that labor was the natural order of things. Memory 2 was the week of my wedding. The house was full of relatives, laughter, and the kind of tension that hides under celebrations. My dad loved hosting events because it gave him an audience where he could shape the story in real time. At one dinner, my aunt complimented the venue Ethan and I had chosen. It was simple, outdoors, something we could afford without asking anyone for help. My dad laughed and said she spends like she deserves it. The room went quiet for half a second, the kind of quiet where everyone decides whether they should laugh. Brandon filled the space immediately and said Lauren will marry anyone to escape this house. My dad nodded like that was wisdom and added that Ethan should be grateful for my last name. Ethan sat there politely because it was my wedding week and he was trying to respect the moment, but I could see the confusion on his face. He had grown up in a family where teasing stopped before it crossed into humiliation, but my family did not have that boundary. By the second year of marriage, the hidden ledger in my life had numbers attached to it, about 15 hours a week handling errands and crisis calls for my family, doctor appointments for my grandparents, insurance forms, holiday planning, emergency grocery runs, phone calls that started with "Can you help?" and ended with 3 more tasks. And there was the so-called loan, $7,000 my dad said he had helped me with years earlier when I moved apartments, except when I asked for the details, later the numbers kept changing. I paid it anyway because fighting about money with my father felt like arguing with gravity. $7,000 gone just to keep the peace. That was when the navy leather folder Ethan bought me started filling up. At first it was just counseling notes and work papers. Then I began sliding other things inside, screenshots of texts, bank confirmations, dates of conversations, emails that contradicted stories told at family dinners. Nothing dramatic, just facts, quiet little anchors of reality. That folder became the first small payoff in a life that had always been one-sided. It meant that if someone tried to rewrite history, I had proof of what I paid and what I carried. So when my dad humiliated Ethan at that steakhouse table, it did not feel like a new event. It felt like the pattern reaching its loudest stage. And sitting there counting my breaths while Brandon filmed and my dad performed, one question kept circling in my mind. Not what my dad would do next, but what he would do when Ethan finally stopped playing small in front of an audience. The trigger for everything started with a group text from my dad late on a Thursday afternoon. Dinner at 7.
Celebrate Brandon's promotion.
Dress like you belong. That was the exact message. No smile, no extra context, just the kind of sentence my dad wrote when he expected compliance. The words looked casual, but if you grew up in my house, you could hear the tone behind them. Show up. Look right. Do not embarrass me. My phone buzzed again a minute later with the usual reactions. Brandon sent a thumbs up emoji. My mom wrote looking forward to it. An aunt added a heart. The whole thread felt like a roll call. I stared at the screen longer than I want to admit. Part of me wanted to say no. Ethan and I had already had a long week. We could have stayed home, ordered takeout, watched a movie, and let the promotion celebration happen without us. But peace had been my default setting for so long that saying no still felt like starting a war. So I typed the same thing I had typed 100 times before. Sounds good. See you at 7. Ethan glanced at my phone and raised an eyebrow and asked gently if I was sure I wanted to go. I told him it was probably nothing, just dinner, just family, repeating the phrase the way people do when they hope it becomes true. By the time we arrived that night, the sky over Austin was fading into that deep blue right before dark. The restaurant my dad chose was the kind of steakhouse designed to feel expensive the moment you walked in. Dim lighting, polished wood, heavy chairs, and a host who spoke in a quiet voice like the whole place was a private club. The hostess led us toward the back where my dad had already claimed a long table, and that was the first moment my stomach tightened because there were more people than I expected. Relatives filled most of the seats, but two men in suits sat near the end of the table laughing politely at something my dad had said. They were not family, they were clients. That was when I realized this dinner was not really about Brandon's promotion, it was a show. My dad stood up when we arrived, clapping Ethan on the shoulder like he was welcoming a guest at a company event. "Lauren, Ethan, good timing," he said loudly. Brandon rose halfway from his chair and lifted his phone before we even sat down, not casually the way people check messages, but upright like someone preparing to record. Then my dad leaned slightly toward him and said something under his breath that I still heard clearly, "Get Ethan when the toast starts." Brandon grinned and nodded. My dad glanced toward my mom and gave her a quick wink like they were both in on a joke, and my mom responded with a tight smile while smoothing her napkin across her lap. That small exchange told me everything. This was planned. A waiter poured water, another brought bread, and the table filled with the low noise of overlapping conversations, but I kept noticing something strange. The restaurant manager hovered near our section more than usual. He walked by twice pretending to check nearby tables, but his eyes kept drifting toward my dad. At first I thought he was just being attentive to a large party. Then it clicked. He recognized my father, not in a friendly way, in a cautious way, the kind of recognition staff develop for customers who are memorable for the wrong reasons. Dinner moved forward like any normal celebration. Brandon talked about his promotion, my dad bragged about the company, and my relatives nodded and laughed in the right places. Then the first glasses were filled for a toast. My dad stood up slowly the way he always did when he wanted the whole room paying attention. He raised his glass and started with Brandon. "My son Brandon," he said proudly, "is the kind of man who brings pride to a family, hardworking, ambitious, someone who understands responsibility." Everyone clinked glasses lightly. Then my dad paused, turned his head slightly toward Ethan, and smiled like he had just remembered a funny story. "Some men bring pride to the table," he continued. "Others bring extra mouths to feed." A few people laughed right away, without fully understanding yet. Then he looked directly at Ethan and delivered the real line. "Tell me something, Ethan, what do you make, really?" The word really hung in the air like a challenge. I felt every muscle in my shoulders tighten, but kept my voice steady and said quietly, "We're not doing this tonight." My dad waved his hand like I was overreacting and said, "Relax, Lauren, this is family honesty." My mom did not look up from her napkin. The relatives shifted uncomfortably. Across the room, a woman sitting at the bar had turned in her chair. She had been watching the exchange closely, studying my dad's face like she was memorizing it. She typed something quickly into her phone, then stood, paid her bill, and walked out of the restaurant without even finishing her dessert. At the time, she was just a stranger who had witnessed an ugly moment. I did not know her name yet, but something in the way she watched my father told me she had seen enough to act on it, and that small moment, that quiet message sent from a bar stool, had already started a chain reaction none of us at that table understood yet. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from a number I did not recognize. "Good morning. This is Marissa Caldwell. I was the woman at the bar last night. I saw what he did. You are not crazy." I stared at the screen for a long moment before answering. Part of me felt relief because someone outside my family had witnessed it, but another part of me felt nervous because when strangers step into family conflict, things tend to escalate. Marissa explained quickly. She worked as an operations director for Keystone Supply Partners, and the CEO was Nadia Reyes. They were in Austin reviewing potential vendors, and my dad's company had been pitching to them for weeks. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "Your father was trying to impress us. That dinner was not just family. It was a character display." She added another line that hit even harder. "And the way he spoke to your husband matches concerns already in our vendor file." That sentence changed everything for me. For years, my dad's behavior lived inside our family bubble, where people either defended him or pretended it was normal. Hearing that someone outside our circle had already documented similar issues made something inside my chest finally settle. The humiliation had not been in my head. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been a pattern. Marissa asked if there was any documentation of what happened behind the scenes, text messages, financial records, anything showing how my dad operated with family and money. I looked at Ethan. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply reached for the navy leather folder he had given me months earlier and set it on the kitchen table. Inside were quiet pieces of truth, screenshots of messages, notes with dates, emails saved because something about them had felt wrong at the time. Layer 1 was simple, texts between my dad and Brandon from earlier that week about the dinner. Brandon had written, "Should I film the toast?" And my dad replied, "Yes, get Ethan when it starts." There was also a message from my mom sent to me hours before the dinner that read, "Please do not embarrass your father tonight." Reading it again made the intention painfully clear. The performance had been planned. Layer 2 went deeper. Bank confirmations showing the $7,000 I had repaid years earlier, an email from my dad claiming there had never been a loan dispute, and a separate message from his accountant quietly requesting an extension on a payment that contradicted what he told relatives. It was not dramatic evidence, just small contradictions that added up. When word started spreading through relatives that Ethan and I were collecting records, the backlash came quickly. My dad told people I was unstable. Brandon said Ethan was manipulating me. The story quickly turned into Lauren is dramatic and Ethan wants the inheritance. It was the same script they always used when someone challenged the hierarchy. So, I want to ask you something. Would you send the receipts immediately, or would you wait until there is a room full of witnesses? Because that decision changes the entire outcome. Marissa texted again that afternoon with a short message. "Boardroom meeting Monday at 9:30 a.m. CEO requested Ethan present." And just like that, the next stage was set. The boardroom meeting was scheduled for Monday morning, but Sunday night my parents hosted a charity dinner at their country club. It was the kind of event my dad loved. Donors, polished speeches, people shaking hands under soft lights, a room full of witnesses who believed he was the most generous man in Austin. Brandon walked around telling everyone a huge contract was about to close, while my mom moved between tables smiling and quietly reminding me to smile and not look tense. My dad worked the room like a politician shaking hands, every laugh loud, every story carefully exaggerated. Ethan and I stayed quiet. Marissa had warned us earlier that day that my father thought he already had the deal, and people who feel safe often expose themselves one more time before the truth arrives. So we waited. The clock inside my head was loud. Less than 12 hours until the boardroom meeting, less than 12 hours until my dad discovered the truth. During the cocktail hour, he introduced Ethan to a group of donors, calling him my daughter's sweet husband, and then adding with a grin that he was between careers right now, so he had plenty of free time. People laughed politely while Brandon lifted his phone again. My dad leaned closer and asked Ethan if he could afford the club membership, then waved to a waiter and said loud enough for the table to hear, "Bring him a kid's menu." The donors laughed like it was harmless humor, but Ethan stayed calm and simply said no thank you. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, timing. If you had been sitting there, would you have confronted him in that moment, or waited until the boardroom and let the receipts speak? Later that night, as we walked to the parking lot, Ethan squeezed my hand and said quietly, "Tomorrow they will hear everything." Halfway home, my phone buzzed again with a message from Marissa. Security video from the steakhouse is saved. Witness statements confirmed. The boardroom was ready. Monday morning arrived quiet and bright, the kind of Texas morning where the sky looks calm even when everything underneath it feels tense. At 9:30 a.m., Ethan and I walked into the glass boardroom at Keystone Supply Partners in downtown Austin. The walls were clear, the table long and polished, and the room had that quiet professionalism that makes every word feel heavier. My dad arrived a few minutes later with Brandon and 2 clients trailing behind him. He walked in smiling, confident, already in performance mode. To him, this was just another business meeting where he expected to walk out with a deal and another story about his success. He shook hands like he owned the room. Across the table sat Nadia Reyes, the CEO of Keystone Supply Partners. She did not smile much. Beside her were 2 people from legal and compliance with folders already open in front of them. Their presence alone shifted the atmosphere. This was not a friendly negotiation. It was a review. My dad did not seem to notice and started speaking almost immediately, launching into a polished explanation of his company. He talked about growth, reliability, and relationships, speaking the way he always did when he wanted people to see him as the leader in control. Then, halfway through his pitch, he glanced at me and added one more line, saying Lauren gets emotional sometimes, but the family stands behind me. It was subtle, but it was the same strategy he always used, framing me as unstable before I could say anything. I did not interrupt. For once, I let him finish completely. The room needed to hear his version before it could understand the truth. When he stopped, Nadia Reyes folded her hands calmly on the table and said that before any deal moved forward, they needed clarity on something more important than pricing: integrity. Her eyes shifted toward Ethan, and she gave a small nod. Ethan placed the navy leather folder on the table and opened it slowly. The first receipt was the steakhouse security video. A screen on the wall lit up showing the exact moment from the dinner. My dad standing with his glass raised, Brandon holding his phone, and my dad leaning toward Ethan asking, "What do you make? Really?" The room went very quiet. The second receipt was a set of messages. Ethan slid printed screenshots across the table, texts between Brandon and my dad about filming the toast, and my mom's message to me hours before dinner saying, "Please do not embarrass your father." The third receipt was financial. Bank records showing the $7,000 I had repaid, followed by an email from my dad claiming there had never been a loan issue, and then a message from his accountant asking for extensions on payments he had told people did not exist. The shift in the room was immediate. One of the clients leaned closer to the screen and whispered that the video was real. Brandon stopped moving entirely. His phone stayed on the table, but his hand froze beside it. My dad tried to laugh and waved his hand, saying something about family misunderstandings and jokes taken the wrong way. Nadia Reyes did not laugh. She looked directly at him and spoke with the kind of calm authority you cannot argue with, saying either you step back from leadership or this deal is gone. That was the moment the room changed completely. For the first time in my life, my dad had no control over the audience in front of him. He looked at the screen again, then at the papers, then at Ethan. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out.
He could not speak.
The silence stretched long enough for everyone to understand what had just happened. I leaned forward and said the only sentence I had rehearsed in my head. "We are done carrying your image." Ethan closed the leather folder gently. Then we stood up, and as we walked toward the door, I still did not know whether my dad would fight the truth or finally accept that the room had seen it. The fallout began almost immediately after we left the building. By the time Ethan and I reached the parking garage, my phone was already buzzing. The first message came from my mom. "Stop, you are ruining us." There was no question about what had happened in the boardroom, no curiosity about the documents, no concern about the humiliation Ethan had endured, just panic about the image collapsing. A few minutes later, Brandon called Ethan directly. Ethan let it ring once before answering on speaker. Brandon did not bother with greetings. He said Ethan was a snake, that we had ambushed the family, and that business deals were not the place for family drama. Ethan listened quietly and then said one sentence. The video spoke for itself. After that, Brandon hung up. Keystone Supply Partners handled the situation with a calm professionalism that made the entire thing feel even more real. Their legal team sent a formal vendor review notice that same afternoon. The contract was not canceled, but it was frozen until leadership changes inside my dad's company could be verified. That moment answered one of the biggest questions I had carried for years. My dad had needed that deal. Behind the confident speeches and expensive dinners, his company had been struggling. Cash flow was tighter than anyone knew. The reason he had been so aggressive about securing the Keystone contract was simple. He needed it to stabilize the business. And the claim he had repeated for years that there was no debt, that everything was perfectly controlled, was not true. Late that evening, my dad finally called me. He did not ask how I was or what I wanted. His first words were, "You set me up." I told him the room had simply seen what he chose to do. He refused to apologize and instead repeated the same sentence he had used at dinner. "You married below us." Then he hung up. My mom called about 20 minutes later. Her voice was softer, but the message was familiar. "I wish he did not say it like that," she said. And then after a pause, she asked if we could just pretend none of this happened. She said families move forward by forgetting things. For the first time in my life, I said no without explaining. Not everyone in the family stayed silent, though. 2 relatives eventually sent messages saying they had heard exactly what my dad said at the steakhouse dinner, and one aunt wrote simply that it was wrong. That small acknowledgement meant more than a dozen polite excuses. Ethan and I made one decision very early in the process. We chose justice, not cruelty. We never posted the video online and never shared it publicly. The only place it existed outside our phones was with Keystone's compliance team and their legal review. We were not trying to destroy my dad. We were simply refusing to carry his behavior anymore. A week later, we sent one clear boundary through email. Repay the $7,000 and stop using my inheritance as leverage, or we move to low contact. My dad refused the terms immediately, but a few days later his attorney contacted us asking for a repayment schedule. Paperwork has a way of forcing reality to stay in place. Once the documents were formal, The story could not be rewritten again. Still, the family reaction stayed mixed. Some relatives doubled down and said Ethan had embarrassed my father, while others quietly distanced themselves from the argument entirely. My mom kept texting small things like recipes, photos from old holidays, and updates about relatives, as if normal conversation might smooth everything over. But with my dad's control shrinking for the first time, something new started forming in my life, and I realized I had to learn what peace actually looked like when it was not built around protecting him. The months after the boardroom felt strangely quiet. For the first time in years, Ethan and I stopped chasing approval that was never going to come, and life narrowed into something simple and steady. Ethan focused on his work while I returned to counseling students at school, helping teenagers untangle the same kinds of family dynamics I had just faced in my own life. The difference was that now I understood boundaries in a way I had never truly practiced before. We also built support on purpose, not the accidental kind that shows up at holidays, but the kind you choose. My coworker Kayla became someone I could talk to without filtering every sentence. Ethan reconnected with his mentor Dave, who had guided him through earlier stages of his career, and together we began seeing a couples therapist who helped us protect the marriage that had been tested in public. For me, the biggest change was a simple word I had avoided for years: no. No last-minute errands for relatives, no late-night group chat arguments about family loyalty, no dinners where Ethan was expected to sit quietly while someone else entertained themselves at his expense. Those small decisions changed the rhythm of our lives. A few weeks later, my dad's attorney sent the first installment payment toward the $7,000 I had repaid years earlier. The money itself was not the point. What mattered was that the payment ended the lie that I had imagined the debt. Paperwork does something powerful. It forces the truth to exist in writing. Keystone Supply Partners continued their review as well. Leadership changes were required before the contract could move forward, and part of that process meant Brandon lost his role in the company after the filming incident reached clients. For once, consequences traveled in the same direction as the behavior. My mom continued texting occasionally, recipes she thought I might like, old photos from vacations, updates about distant cousins, but one thing never arrived: an apology for Ethan. Instead of waiting for one, Ethan and I created new rules for the future. If we met family members, it would be in public places. Conversations would stay grounded in real life, not reputation, and if disrespect appeared again, we would leave without debating it. The navy leather folder returned to our kitchen table, but its purpose had changed. Instead of holding evidence, it now held our household budget, the repayment schedule, and documents for the future we were building. One afternoon, I also met with an estate attorney and moved my inheritance into a protected account structure so it could never again be used as a threat or a leash. When the folder closed that evening, our house felt peaceful in a way I had never experienced growing up. I realized something at the same time. I missed the idea of a father, but whether my mom would ever choose truth over loyalty to him was something I could no longer control. Accepting that uncertainty, strangely enough, became the first real version of peace Ethan and I had ever known. Peace did not arrive like a dramatic victory. It arrived quietly. One Saturday morning, Ethan and I sat at our small kitchen table with coffee, sunlight coming through the window, and no tension hanging in the air. The navy leather folder that once carried every receipt and every piece of proof was now resting in a drawer instead of in my hands. For months, that folder had felt like armor, but now it was simply a place to store paperwork. Ethan laughed at something on his phone, the kind of easy laugh that fills a room, and I noticed something in that moment that I had not seen before. He was not scanning the room to see who might take offense, and he was not bracing for another comment or another test. At home, respect had become the default. I realized something else too. I had stopped flinching every time my phone lit up with a family message. That was what peace looked like for us. Not silence, not perfection, just a home where dignity did not need to be defended. The lesson from everything that happened is not about crushing a parent or winning a battle. It is about refusing to let humiliation become a family tradition. When someone uses status, money, or a reputation to shrink your partner, the first responsibility is to protect your household. Document what matters, stay calm, and when the moment comes, let neutral systems speak for the truth. Facts have a quiet power that arguments rarely do. I still care about my mom. That part of my heart did not disappear, but I no longer trade my marriage or my peace just to make her comfortable. Sometimes low contact is not punishment. Sometimes it is simply the healthiest distance. If this story felt familiar to you, take a moment and tell me something. Would you stay or would you leave? And if you want to hear what happened when my dad tried to use my inheritance against us again, make sure you subscribe and share the story with someone who needs it. Because in the end, one truth keeps proving itself. Clarity feels better than chasing every time. I hope you enjoy this video. Please like, subscribe, and share. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video. Until then, take care and goodbye.